Thank you, Devanshi, and extending a very warm welcome to all the people who've logged in and joined in for today's session. As part of the Founders 101 series. So today's session, and I think the whole reason why we had a session where we are discussing digital opportunities is around the situation that we are all faced and into today. So although the current pandemic has had a severe impact on the global economy, as we've all seen, the digital economy has proven instrumental in the battle against COVID-19. The ability to leverage digital tools has become a must for businesses to survive the ongoing crisis, and which is why those who had already embraced internet technology in the past had the advantage of being able to fast track their business growth. If you ask me from perspective, the pandemic has actually accelerated the process of digital transformation almost across all sectors. As we are moving steadily to the recovery stage, we have also been noticing that the pandemic has brought on changes to consumer behavior that are likely to stay here for good. And the question then becomes that, two questions that instantly come to my mind around it is how can we empower entrepreneurs to leverage the digital tools and innovations while navigating this pandemic and beyond? And two, what opportunities should the entrepreneurs really, have their antennas tuned into to adapt to the new consumer behaviors? While we are all clear by now that an ecosystem which is built upon digital economy is more resilient, is more adaptable to change, and which is why we believe that the digital economy is going to play an increasingly important role in the recovery of, the global economy post COVID-19. We are here to discuss what are the opportunities that the new normal is about to bring in, and what are the investor perspectives, around it. What is the market thinking about it, and how are we trying to adapt ourselves to the situation? If you look at the digital economy, essentially while it's a departure and a huge departure from the traditional business models, because its focus is really on a lot of shared value creation. What we've seen people relying during the outbreak is like online marketplaces, cashless payments, contactless delivery, and live streaming, which has almost become ubiquitous now. And when we look at building an ecosystem around it, entrepreneurs need to adopt a platform approach which can really enable multiple players to solve issues together, come together and solve issues. Uh, Another interesting opportunity that really opens up is the ability to build new systems from ground up. And we could see a lot of rise in the startup and the SME space, from the emerging market and the SME space, where people will be in a more advantageous position in terms of creating new models or pivoting their existing models to adapt to the new situation, bring about a change in the way we've been looking at the market. And so obviously the startups who can pivot their venture and the team to adopt to the digital technologies and enable their customers, partners, local community in general will obviously have the best opportunity to survive and thrive in the long term. On this note, I think let me welcome a very exciting panel we have today to discuss this. TCM, to start with you, he's the founding and managing director of Chirag Ventures, and has over 35 years of industry experience, and also sits on the boards of Lenskart, AgroStar, Vayan, and eShakti. Uh, Moving to Karthik, who's the co-founder of Bloom Ventures. He's been instrumental in some of very notable investments from the Bloom portfolio, including Servify, Belong, Grey Orange Robotics, Unacademy, Healthify Me, and Rail Yatri. Before I move on to the in-house expert, we have Nishith, introducing Praveen, who's the partner of Pine Ray Partners and founder of the startup Europe India Network, which is essentially the Europe India tech and impact investing corridor. He advises VCs and impact investments firms particularly, and is a private investor in early stage tech companies also. He also sits on the board of Funding London. And lastly, we have Nishith, who's the managing director of Nishith Associates, who's here to bring in a perspective from the legal industry and how he sees the market evolving. So, from here on, let me start on and start with TCM first. So TCM, while we see that the pandemic has been disrupting the global economy, disrupting production, diminishing demands for many goods and services, broken supply chains. A lot of enterprises actually forced to shut down or scale down operations. What are your views around this whole digital transformation? How do you see the market, from here on?
See, already even before COVID, I think most enterprises were moving towards digital and over the last 4 or 5 years. But I think the pace at which they were looking at what they are going digital for was very different, where they were looking at technology as an enabler, right? The difference between the traditional companies and the startups is that startups are using technology as a disruptor to, to existing businesses, whether it is through business models as well as using and technology to disrupt existing businesses. So so they are naturally already inclined to use tech in a significant way. And I think when traditional businesses today look at it, and even consumers look at becoming more and more digital, and like you mentioned, in terms of with less physical interaction, even payments or purchases or consumption of media, I think that's going to be a tailwind for the startup community. That's our long-term view. Obviously, in the short run, they all will have to manage in terms of their cash burn and runways. But I think this is a long-term tailwind for startup industry.
Understood. I think over to you, Nishith, in terms of what business models and technologies are you seeing are coming up or are evolving, partially because of the pandemic or because they were already existing, as cCep mentioned, but they are now pivoting or shaping up into new and enlarged forms.
Yeah, that's very interesting question. And if I take a view from a lawyer, okay, what we have seen is there is a new rise of what is called regulatory entrepreneurs. So they have found a white space between law, tax, and business strategy, but looking at the gaps in the regulations, where regulations don't really exist, and they try to solve problems of those. Now, regulatory entrepreneurship, one would say, is not something new. It has happened in the past for a long time. That people put their phone on mute, please. So, what we have seen is this that there's, I'm so sorry, there's a lot of disturbance somewhere. If people can put the, yeah, it's on mute. Thank you. So, let me explain to you what I mean by regulatory entrepreneurs. Now, when people look at the law and find gaps and use those gaps for creating a value. Now, this has happened in the past for decades together, where people use these gaps in law. But the difference, and the main difference, is that the old generation entrepreneurs, many of them or most of them, used those gaps for their own personal benefit to start with. New generation entrepreneurs have used those gaps to create value for the public first, and in the process, found value for themselves. So the new age case studies are Uber, Airbnb, DraftKings, all those. If you see even the blockchain things that are coming up, there are no regulations, and the gaps are found, and these are all for the benefit of the larger community. And those are called regulatory entrepreneurs. They have created huge value. In fact, in the business plan, now significant amount is provided for dealing with the regulatory issues that may come up on the ways. So there are ambiguities, and they are faced, like Uber would provide a special budget if at all there was a fine in New York. Okay, assume for a moment, and there or other kind of cases where Airbnb, for the rentals, okay, tenancy laws, there were some gaps in that, but they created huge new space. It is just not exploiting existing space, but I think what was vacuum, I think they're connected. So, and if some of you are interested in this subject, my friend Elizabeth Bowman, she has written a paper on this particular subject with use case studies on regulatory entrepreneurs, and we'll be happy to share if some of you are interested in that. So new models are capturing technology, number one. They are looking at the regulatory arbitrage, but at the same time creating first value for public. It is public which becomes advocates, not the lawyers to start with. They say, we want Uber, we want Airbnb, we want this and that, So they actually become the so-called, in good sense, the lobbyist, to get the things right done that way. So this is new thing that we have found lately. And secondly, that no business model would survive unless, as I think TCM mentioned, that it's more of a disruptor now. So in every industry, I think we have to look at that. We are ourselves finding, while many businesses are facing huge problems, but new age businesses are finding new valuations. I believe Zoom has zoomed to some $60 billion. Okay. And all of us are now finding that we are more productive, we are more efficient, more connected with families. Okay. Life, work, the harmony has improved. And we are finding at least 2 to 3 hours a day not commuting. In Mumbai, some of you know that we have, in at Marine Drive, the dolphins are seen, and at Chapati, peacocks are seen, and Jew Beach, some deers are there, never before, So I think we are finding even the sky is so much cleaner. And we even as a law firm have decided to go almost 100% virtual now. And even if you go 80%, it's still good. If 80 cars don't come out of 100 to your office, you're saved environment. So we are seeing a lot of new business models that are coming around, these kind of things. And of course, as usual, in the healthcare sector, because this is the immediate issue, a lot of work is going on in other technologies that are connecting people. So I think media, entertainment, everything, we are seeing new technology, whatever, TMT, and particularly pharma healthcare space, we have seen maximum activities, and of course consumer, and partly beside, now financial restructuring, etc. But if you talk industry per se, it's mostly TMT and pharma, healthcare, nanotechnology, medical devices connected with IoT and whatnot. So we've seen a lot of those kind of situations which have come up. So that's my take on your question.
Thank you, Nishith. Over to you, Praveen. You work with a lot of tech and investment companies and firms across Europe and India. What is your view around around the current Indian tech space?
So, thank you, Nashita. So, if you look at the Indian tech space, and especially in the last decades, so it has seen a tremendous growth both in tech creation but also the capital availabilities. So, looking forward for the next 5, 10 years, I think the primary question is where does Indian tech go from here, and what are the opportunities that the Indian tech could grab? And Indian consumer technology and scaling of those consumer technologies will continue to happen. There is a lot of growth to be still seen in the digital commerce and media consumption and so on and so forth. But for the next decade, I think it's going to be a largely a story of how is the deeper technology opportunities that India could capture on. So you talk about AI, ML, IoT, blockchain. So blockchain is still to be has a lot of potential, but still in its early stages. But also domains such as edtech, and more particularly also building the sustainability angle. I think within the digital business models would also be key. Particularly you see in the current COVID situation and beyond, we will talk a lot of sustainability and how to actually manage the digitalization along with sustainability. So these are opportunities that I think that the Indian startup ecosystem is already starting to happen. The VCs are talking about it. New technologies are being created in the market for that. But we need to create, or the Indian tech ecosystem has to create scalable enterprise technologies that can globally compete effectively. So I think that's an opportunity that needs to be addressed very seriously. That would actually call for building the scaling talent on the enterprise sector back to India, particularly the diaspora talent, and so on and so forth. And in the COVID situation, we are also seeing a lot of acquisitions happening, and a lot of closures would also happen in terms of the startups. And I think a critical component in making the vibrant tech ecosystem going is to really focus on the seed stage of the startups as well. So how large a funnel can be continuously created would play a bigger role in terms of making this Indian tech ecosystem sustainable over the next 5 years to 10 years. I think it's a critical situation that we are in when we are going to see consolidation in the space. And also from the venture perspective, where it's very critical that the venture firms also generate the kind of returns to get a sustainable ecosystem going. So we are saying that many of the Indian venture firms are going to be looking at nearing the end of their term of the fund. So that would mean that how do you really generate those LP returns that can come back into further investments in the Indian tech space? So if you look at SoftBank, they made a pretty good soundbite in terms of they're going to look at secondary transactions in the Indian tech. So that would give some return opportunities for the VCs, I think, which could be grabbed upon. To have a sustainable ecosystem where the newer technologies is being created and where the capital continues to flow back into the ecosystem, I think really focusing on the seed stage funnel to be increased and also the returns to be generated by the VCs to the LPs is also should be the focus. And I will make a final point. I think also that where India needs to really up its game would be in the R&D space. Whereas you see globally, the leading countries are spending about 2% of GDP in the R&D space. And now we are talking about deeper technologies that by definition requires a lot of R&D spending. India has been hovering around 0.7% in terms of the GDP size into the R&D spending. And this has to really go up. And there is a huge case to be made for public capital and public government initiatives to also be catering to the space to create a sustainable ecosystem going forward for India.
Thanks, Praveen. Having said that, I understood what the current situation looks like, from an investor perspective. TCM, what are your views? How are the investors or the startups adapting to the new environment? Give some examples around it.
Yeah, in fact, some of the interesting things that we have noticed in our portfolio are that many of the startups have actually launched new product offerings in the last two months' time. Okay, and many of them was also focused on the digital channel in a big way. So we have a company called PureFit, which had 250 gyms, and it had their consumers who were both using the gyms as well as a little bit on the online space. And they have actually, since the gyms got locked out and they are yet to reopen, in this last 10 weeks, their daily active users has gone up 10 times, right? And purely online. So their plans, which possibly were in terms of focusing on online at least 1.5 years hence, have been accelerated. So these are some of the things that we notice. In fact, online, offline companies which are there, the share of online has gone up substantially during this period of lockdown, right? And consumers are adapting online much faster, and the product improvements which are helping the online to happen in terms of AI or even AR, VR to help consumers to take decisions digitally are actually going up. One other thing that I expect to happen, and that we saw that in some of the companies, is that the SMEs who were earlier not adapting technology so freely are now moving more and more towards technology. Whether it is in terms of Kirana stores now actually downloading an app, sending it to customer and asking them to order on that, or using digital payments more. I think all these are seeing a significant increase. So India SME SaaS play will become real now.
Understood. So I think evidence from across the globe, and taking it from what where TCM left, particularly if you look at the stats coming in from China, Brazil, India, Colombia, United States, they clearly show that demand for delivery services and e-commerce is going to increase as as people under stay-at-home orders have no other choice but to shop, order, and pay digitally. The pandemic is surely here to change customer behavior in many ways. And this trend of increased demand for delivery services and e-commerce will likely be sustained, even after the lockdowns lift. From here, so Karthik, how do you see the customer behaviors or the consumer patterns changing post COVID-19?
So I think So the three sets of customers, as TCM touched, one is, enterprises, and then SMBs, and then consumers. I think enterprises have no choice. The dependencies they've had on historically having, very inefficient value chains, whether it is on the supply chain side, on the employee side, on the customer delivery side. And as long as there is a better, faster way to do it through a digital product or through technology, the adoption rates, I think, are just going to move dramatically faster in this decade, right? And it was poised for that, as everybody hoped and was waiting to see, but there was no imperative to do it as much as in this particular year. So especially when we're looking at a lot of our portfolios in venture in India have anywhere between 20 and 40% of our exposure to US and global enterprise markets as well. So I think this is a huge lift in that direction for such startups. Indian SMBs and consumers, especially if you go past the first 100 million consumers, you can see that they've been waiting to be given tools at a price point, at a certain UI, at a certain value point, that they're actually able to make an impact to their own lives, right? And I think Geo was the first moment when we started seeing this happen at a scale. For about 15 years, a lot of that audience was, happy to get cheap voice telephony. They had some data access, but was, relatively speaking, compared to most people on this call, most of that part of India was disenfranchised by either the ability of getting nifty tools, which are basically app-based, or having devices which were world-class but $150 or $100 equivalent, or having data for that matter, which was priced the way Geo was. So that momentum was already built. So I've always kind of said internally that Geo was a much bigger moment than demonetization, right? We have both happened in the same quarter. And what you're seeing today is 3 years of learning on that platform on very cheap data. Give me more to be able to make my life simpler. For us, the incremental benefit sometimes you get out of making a digital payment or having a new way of making a digital payment, I would argue is the incremental benefit is far lesser than for my maid or for my driver or for my office employee, for whom it's life changing. They don't have to go to a branch. They don't have to figure out how to get a few hundred rupees of credit. And so I think those industries are beginning to see the impact of digitizing just the workflow to access their customers. Customers are just waiting. They're saying, give it to me. But it has to happen at a price point that's viable for both the startup and the customer. That means it has to be digital. You can't send a person from, Malad to South Bombay to come and give you a 500 rupee loan, right? And so surprisingly, even in the lowest strata where we've seen certain businesses where the entire flow was digital, and suddenly we're seeing a huge uplift in this COVID timeframe, which is so I think it's here to stay and it's here to accelerate dramatically. And I counterintuitively, I'm saying it's the masses who are going to benefit the most.
Which is interesting. I think also, if we see the global trends and immediately after the outbreak, and taking a cue from China, as part of I was reading somewhere, last week that as part of the Alibaba global initiatives, the company had actually announced some 20 measures to support businesses which were hit by the pandemic, which included like stores in China were forced to close and merchants from a wide range of industries were turned to, Taobao Live in a bid to reach their consumers online and maintaining sales, and several other initiatives around it. So again, question both to TCM and Karthik, how are you guys, helping the companies adjust? Are you guys taking measures to help your portfolios to adjust to the new situation, or taking them digital? How are you guys, helping them?
See, our companies are born digital, right? So for us, actually, that is, we have not faced a challenge on that front. I think where we have been very pleasantly surprised is the pace at which they were able to come up with new or multiple product offerings, pivots, actually, some of them. See, one of the important things in this pandemic is, I think the economic impact of this is going to get noticed by consumers going forward, right? Not yet. I think a few job losses have started, job cuts and salary cuts have started. I think a lot of discretionary will get postponed. So what some of these companies have been able to do is, in terms of how do you become must have, how do you provide a must-have offering instead of a good-to-have offering, which is going to have lesser demand coming back, right? That is something that we noticed that many of them have moved forward. Actually, one of the B2B companies has launched a PP business, which was not even in their plan, right? And they are actually ramping up very fast. So they increase their addressable market, and this PP business, because of the players that they are operating with, in the medium to long term, will become a complete medical supplies business, right? So which is possibly equal to the size of their other B2B business that they were having. So their addressable market has gone up substantially, right? That is the pace of change that we have seen. That is very encouraging.
From our perspective, I think VCs and investors, we can't give us more credit than is due, right? So it's the founders will have to adapt broadly to what's on the ground reality. You can bring sort of certain value adds and inputs from people who've been there, done that, who've lived through crisis before, and we brought as many of those voices as early as possible, because founders are grappling in a situation with so many variables coming at them which they're not used to. So you take best practices. What I might have said this to you once before, Ashmita. What VCs are good at recognizing patterns, right? And we match patterns for a living. Whether it's in boardrooms, whether it's in best practices, whether it's in exits, whether it's in entries. So what we've tried to do very well is to take what one company is doing extremely well and propagate it as rapidly as possible as not a vaccine, but as a cure to as many other companies as possible, right, in the portfolio. And how quickly you do that allows for the bloodletting or the triaging to work better, right? To use.
Absolutely.
You can't assume that sitting there doing calls with them or everybody being in a remote environment, there's only so much you can add a specific value to. The second thing you want to do is, if a business is in a post-COVID tailwind state, or if there is a shortage of, or if there is attractiveness from, the inside, you're the insider, you have inside data. It's your job to surface it to the external capital markets, because people are going to look for what will take off in the next 18 months. And they're looking for great opportunities. And so we are trying to highlight the best companies in this environment to external investors. So you're getting them more capital is obviously very important. And the last part of that is you need to be able to sit down and give them a true mirror to their faces and say, are you going to look like a better business 12 to 18 months from now? Even after one is survival, but even if you survive, are you going to look like a better business? Because you're probably not going to be looking very attractive from VC lens even then. Because there'll be newer business models which catch attention, and people in the next 12 months are going to focus only on tailwind sectors or blue sky sectors. They're not going to focus on, oh, he's done well by surviving 12 months. Let me give him capital, right? And so this is our harsh take on our portfolio.
See, just to supplement what Karthik said, one more area I think where almost all investors have contributed on the board is actually the whole BCP and risk management, enterprise risk management. Was an area which I don't think any startup ever bothered about, right? They were growing so fast. They were so busy fighting fires on a daily basis. Now that is, very, very important today. In fact, one question when I asked a founder saying that what if you get affected by COVID for 2 weeks and you are, quarantined and you cannot operate. Do you have actually today a written policy of who all will do what, right? And how your company will run is a question that actually made him think. And that those are areas which I think investors and board members can contribute.
That's actually interesting, TCM. We generally don't. We spend a lot of time deliberating on how to pivot and the larger discussion in the boardroom, but we don't look at the and focus on the finer details of what happens if the founder goes down with COVID-19 and how does the business run, who manages, who's taking care of the affairs. That was helpful, to understand how are we. How are the VCs in India, tackling and handling the situation, sitting in their own spaces. Praveen, over to you in terms of from an outsider perspective. What are the opportunities that you see that the Indian startups can really grab on? from a Europe-India corridor perspective or otherwise?
So, if you look at, I think what happened with the Geo with the recent fundraise, I think that's really going to be probably a defining or a critical moment for the Indian tech ecosystem with the 13 billion raise, and it might have a pretty good externalities, positive externalities to the larger tech ecosystem in India. From the bottom up perspective, I think Karthik mentioned about the enterprise, SMB, and the consumer spaces, and a large amount of this, technology solutions and digital solutions at the right pricing point to be given to the SMB, and also the digital commerce push and remote first business models that could be driven within the Indian consumer space are something that we will continue to see a large growth immediately post-COVID situation. But when it comes to enterprise, I think the top dollars is going to be international. It's the traditional international market for the Indian enterprise has been the US. But if you look at what's happening in Europe, a huge amount of digitalization is already accelerated with the enterprise companies. The European companies are if you take Germany, for example, the automotive sector is the biggest and most critical sector for Germany. And that is going through a huge transformation with the arrival of Tesla and the likes. And the digitalization of the enterprises are starting to happen here. And many of the startups are addressing it in a big way. I think frankly, I think the Indian tech ecosystem, both the venture capital ecosystem and also the tech ecosystem, has not reached Europe in a big way. And I think, Frank, it's a big missed opportunity. Both from understanding what Europe is, how to sell into Europe, the difference in the economics and also difference in the cultures within the European market is least understood on the Indian side. And to be fair, also the European market has not focused largely on India as well. I think this is an opportunity for the India to also reach out to the European market, particularly from the enterprise perspective, as Indian startups build globally competitive solutions. So I think what has to be done on the external front from the opportunity perspective is to say define what does and what should India stand for in the next decade or so, and that I would arguably that would be really the ISRO model, where you really create globally competitive technology at compelling prices and to be able to compete with global startups from day one, and to reach out to markets such as Europe in a big way with, I think would be a great opportunity. And that would also call for how do you align yourself with where the European momentum is going, which is largely pushing in every business models, there is a sustainability angle to be seen. I think those are topics that the Indian startup ecosystem has to be better informed in terms of selling into the European market and frankly to the international markets when it comes to enterprise. And I think, from the consumer and the consumption story, for example, a remote first business models is definitely interesting, but also spaces like EdTech, it still have to be played out. And I think India is starting to do very well there. If you take the top 15 EdTech companies globally in terms of the valuation, you have Baiju at the top. The rest are all China and the US companies. But I think India is just getting started. There's a huge potential there to be played out as well.
Sure. So Praveen, you just mentioned that the Indian startups have for some reason missed out on the opportunity of penetrating into the European markets for one reason or the other, because also traditionally because the focus largely has been US for the startups looking out of India. So is there something in terms of the top three sectors that come to your mind, or is there some what is it that we should really let the startups know in terms of the audience here as to what are they really missing? What is it the top three industries that they should look at or they should follow in terms of the European market and where they have opportunities lying?
Yeah. So I've been working with a few Indian startups. Actually, I also privately invested in a startup called Clarisites, which is essentially an Indian startup that has moved to sell into Germany, and the founder and the management team has moved to Germany, which is now being backed by many of the European investors as well. So what you really see is that AI ML is a space where applied in different sectors across the financial services sector. If you want to sell into the financial services sector, UK is a great market to sell into. And if you're looking at data analytics and automotive sector play and digitalization of the automotive supply chain and SME financing and even invoice factoring type of companies, you really see a huge opportunity on the SMB space in Europe, but also broadly across the enterprise sector in terms of digitalization of their supply chain, but also digitalization of their inside infrastructure is seeing a great momentum, and that's where you see a lot of these startups are springing up to be addressed. And I think India has a great opportunity to sell there if you really start using a compelling competitive technology, but at a compelling price point. What's good for India is worked out in the current strategic standpoint is that India is seen as a rather friendly country, and the European players are rather open. So when you look at what's happening in Europe in the post-Brexit situation, UK is prioritized India as one of the priority countries. So you will see a lot of these opportunities being open for the Indian enterprises. So to look into the UK to sell into the financial services business and to look into the enterprise digitalization, to look into automation, these are areas in the UK market. If you look at more broadly across the European market, you will see there is a huge amounts of emphasis being done on the AI/ML space, blockchain space, and also in the sustainability investment space. So, across these verticals, you will see in Germany, you will see a lot of the opportunities in the automotive sector and the space technologies and cybersecurity. In France, you will see opportunities on the luxury industry, but also in the wine industry and automotive industry as well. So I think Europe cannot be seen as a monolith opportunity. You have to take a individual market perspective to sell into, but to sell into enterprises and digitalization and the supply chain optimization or the market opportunities, I think the Indian startups have to can actually take advantage of.
Sure. Thank you, Praveen. Thank you for giving a perspective. And I think it would be helpful for the audience to understand that maybe it's time they also start looking at the European markets with a fresh head. And there are opportunities lying there as well. And correct, as apart from US and UK, which has been there in the minds of the Indian startups, Europe is another one. Moving on to the whole idea of digital sovereignty, which is essentially a key idea in the internet age. The idea that parties must have sovereignty over their own digital data, which can be applied both on an individual basis or towards nation. The bottom line being that the digital sovereignty involves consideration of how data and digital assets should be treated. And from there on, what is and that's a question I have for the panel in general to all of you, to pitch in terms of what are your views on the whole digital sovereignty. We've been hearing cries from from Europe, different parts, including Paris, Brussels. We have our own Make in India, Digitize in India, and the whole campaign around it. So what are your views on how this will shape up? So maybe we can start with Nishith.
Well, yeah, I think let me give you a philosophical perspective, and then I think further things can evolve. Fundamentally, I believe that the data is owned by an individual, and at the time even has come when there's a lot more talk about individual sovereignty over the state sovereignty. The whole concept of state, of course, for a moment there has been little anti-globalization and stuff like that, but the concept of state is coming under question by the academicians and the theorists. So fundamentally, it is the individual who owns data and not the countries or the companies. Okay. Now, to what extent you compromise, you give, that is for individual to decide. I think we have to bring a new framework for that purpose. And it is very important. In fact, I was reading this morning. Interestingly, Anand Mahindra has invested in that company called Hemp, and with a particular emphasis to challenge, I would say, I think Facebook and in social networking setting. So, in view of the Facebook Cambridge Analytics scandal that happened, and so the whole new model also will have to be evolved around that, and to what extent you can use data. In fact, IBM, yesterday I read that they have decided not to go further development into face recognition space because they again believe that from a broader perspective, it has more chances for abuse by the state or even otherwise. So there are a lot of interesting things that are happening, and one will have to look at which models are going to be evolved, bearing in mind what you call stakeholder concept. Okay, even we'll discuss at some point in time the new regulations, even code of conduct. SEBI has come out with some time ago about the investor stewardship governance. So in that, the investors now also have a responsibility. So far, you thought it was directors and the members of the board of directors or other people have certain responsibility, but now it is on the investors also certain responsibilities are coming out, because the investors ultimately also represent public at large. So when you look at pension plans, so the sovereign funds, whose money is there? They're public money. So if when they invest, they also have to look at 360 degrees and see how this technology is going to impact public and the society at large. So very interesting concepts are coming out, and we'll have to work towards that.
Sure. Karthik, would you have any views around that?
No, nothing different from what Nishith said. So I'll save the time for other questions.
I have a contrary view. While governments are actually getting lot more creating barriers in terms of data protection, data residency, where it will be stored and things like that, I think end consumer is going to choose what they want to use, whether it is Facebook or TikTok. And I don't think we are going to decide, we are going to let the government decide also in terms of what should be used. This, I think, from that perspective, the digital natives are the ones who will decide what they want. And I think only the data protection being on the shore will be the major change that has already happened. For the rest, consumer will decide. But consumer will also get the choice in the form of GDPR and related ways in terms of what information they are willing to share or not willing to share or marketed to.
So TCM, I was saying the same thing, that the control of government will come under more and more question. Although,
Okay.
for example, I wrote an article a little while ago on autonomous weapons. We have talked about autonomous vehicles and other kind of stuff, but I said autonomous weapons. And if you have all this individual data, tomorrow, you can have surgical strike on an individual. You can write the name of TCM or Nishith Desai on a bullet, and that bullet will go and hit that individual specifically. So there are dangers to some of those things. Of course, every technology is a dual-edged sword. I agree 100% that it is the individual who owns data, to what extent he would like to release and in what manner and for what purpose. I think those are the new things that we'll have to work on. That data is given for a purpose, no more than that, can be used by anybody. But how do you stop that? That will require new technology for people like you. I think Ramesh Raskar I think he's talking about that you can have data only on your phone. Nobody else can have it. Only anonymized data can go. So those are really interesting solutions which technology can provide to the regulatory issues. And that has been my point that, so far we have looked at technology as technology solving problems of the people for functionality purposes. But now we have to solve larger problems at a societal level. And that is where what is called driver in the driverless, which Vivekananda spoke about. Now, who is going to drive all this thing? It is you and me and others have to do it. Governments are not going to do it. It's, companies will have a different interest. So I think it is ultimately individual data. Once that question I've been asking, who owns data? I think this is the most important question that we have to really put an end to, and then everything will flow in a sequence.
Praveen, would you want to add something to this?
Sure. I mean, I think the first and foremost is data has become a central point of whatever that you're building today in the digital economy. So I think it's critical to have a very healthy debate on how and what the data sovereignty or digital sovereignty means to and should mean to people. I think for starting from the fundamental perspective that you own your own data and you control your own data, so individually, And then then you go from there to what does the countries and how do the countries or the governments or the regulators have a role to play or not is the next question. I think my opinion on is that you both have both has their role to play. The consumers will eventually decide on where and how the data has to be shared, and there needs to be digital business models built towards allowing and enabling consumers to make the choice. Currently, we don't have, so I don't know where all my data has been dispersed, and I do not know how it's being used. And the European perspective to that is that there is a governmental role to play, and GDPR has been, from the privacy standpoint of view, has been a pretty bit leadership role in the space, really spearheading the momentum in terms of the privacy laws globally, including India. What's happening in the European perspective is to say that Europe is taking even a larger role. The France is talking about digital tax being imposed on bigger tech corporates. But also more importantly, that Europe has talked about four things that Europe is missing. One is that Europe does not have an operating system on its own. Europe does not have a search engine, and Europe does not have a social network, and it does not have the cloud infrastructure to compete with the likes of AWS and Microsoft and so on and so forth. And most recently that France and Germany has come together to put together what is called Gaia X, a cloud infrastructure that is essentially European. So the Microsoft and Google and all the cloud providers can participate in that in terms of building a cloud infrastructure for Europe, but it has to follow the principles of Gaia X that has been defined as by the European countries. I think essentially we're going to keep on seeing this in the next years to come, the business models being catering to those digital sovereignty, and the consumers having a very important say. But I think that we cannot miss the fact that government and the regulators will step in as Europe starts to push ahead, and US will start reacting, and then I think we will see other countries also needing or pushing to be taking a position in this as well.
Sure, and I think that was very insightful to understand how people view digital sovereignty and where do we see it going now. And as startups and venture capitalists, I think we've spoken enough on how the industry of entrepreneurs and venture capital firms are adapting to the new normal. And while the industry was busy doing this, the government also has been busy figuring out newer laws and regulations around tightening certain existing regulations, regulations around surrounding investments. And very lately, I think one of the regulations that caught the minds of the industry was the Press Note 3, which was issued by the government on April 18th, 2020. So basically, in an attempt to curb the opportunistic takeovers and acquisitions of the Indian companies due to the current pandemic, the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade, DPIIT, by way of Press Note 3 of 2020, announced a very critical change to the consolidated foreign direct investment policy. The change essentially called for prior approval of the government for any foreign investment which is coming in by an entity which is based in any country sharing a border with India, or if the beneficial interest lies with any such entity. While we are still awaiting, as an industry at large, including the law firms, venture capitalists, startups, they're all waiting for some more clarity around the regulations in terms of what constitutes beneficial ownership. Is there a threshold to the beneficial ownership that the government is really indicating at? Let's just hear from Karthik on his views, around this, and how has he, how is he reacting to the new regulation, and how does he see it impacting the industry at large?
Harshita, there's one is it a source of capital which will face undue stress because of a harsher regulatory environment? Not, I think, across the board. I think they might take a more careful note of what our neighbors are doing, specifically with assets that which are either critical to the country, like market assets, or in the startup world. From our lens, we can say that there are companies where they have a very large stake in certain businesses, including a lot of unicorns. So those, they will definitely want a filtration mechanism where they're able to see who are the shareholders, what is the pattern, who's trying to buy new stakes, etc. So the minute that goes through that scrutiny process, I don't know how if it's only a procedural thing, it doesn't change much other than a timeline of 6 to 8 weeks is our expectation. If it's harsher than any, then it might create a bit of a red flag. So it's too premature to make a judgment on that, because all the industry representations have been faced with who said we are doing anything adverse. So that's one counterclaim. Second is we just want to make sure that we can't have different set of rules for different players. So whether it's $500,000 into a Series A company, or it's a 5 million or 50 million or 500 million, the process can't suddenly be carved out separately. So there is a uniform process, but we're going to be broadly benevolent to this. We'd love to see more capital come in whichever part of the world, but there will be a process if it comes from these parts of the world. So the process definition has not yet come through. Every week, I hope that will be this week, but I've waited now 3-4 weeks, so like everyone else. So we're hoping that it's around the corner.
Sure. Sure. I think, with this, we'll probably direct a few questions that have come specifically for Karthik and TCM on. So I'll leave it to you guys to decide which ones to pick, Karthik, because Karthik and TCM both. So I think one is around, in this COVID scenario, what will be the new normal criteria of the angels and VCs in choosing the investments? And will there be any change in your expectations on unit economics, financials, etc.? I mean, it could be a different answer by both TCM and Karthik. So I'll leave it to you guys to counter this one.
We'll go as fast as possible, and then TCM can add to my 2 lines. I think I've become a sort of huge fan of a sustainable VC environment, which essentially is the end state of what we're all playing for, which is cash exits. We've been fortunate to see a few in the last 2-3 years. I don't think from our LP environment, who are our investors in all our funds, we've been told it's not enough. We need to show more. And so you want to build in that direction, and you want to take companies public. You want to get bigger public companies to be acquiring. Broadly, I think the eventual cash exit will get paid for solidity of a business model, right? So when you say unit economics, financials, etc., the person buying is largely not a fool, right? They are buying something which they think is of value. So I don't think there is a huge gap between a public market investor and a very mature or intelligent late stage private market investor, or a strategic acquirer for that matter. So eventually all of us will have to build in that direction. The WeWork debacle, the Uber crash in price all showed that last year was a turning point, not just for India, for global markets as well. In India, doubly so, because we have another burden on our head where we need to prove that we're able to sustainably build profitable unicorns. I think some of them are on the verge of there. I think in the next 2 years, I won't be surprised if we see our first public market, companies from this universe of unicorns. And that will be the first, encouraging sign that we have turned the full cycle around, right? And if the Indian markets don't want to accept them, I'm hoping that with the new announcement that the government made, we'll be able to take more companies to offshore markets as well. So I think all of it's coming to a head in the next 2 years. The ecosystem will demand it, and I think the boardrooms are already saying that's how we want to build big companies from here on.
So just to supplement one thing, I think the bar has gone up, and bar has gone up not just on unit economics, which has always been our view, but I think more importantly, it has gone up in the sense that earlier more business model changes got funded. I think going forward, there will be more deeper technology disruptions that will get funded. I think that is something that will be the change that I see happening. At least internally, we are betting on the fact that, and we are focusing on that area, and we are able to actually find such companies. And I'm sure, Karthik has also invested in such exciting companies in the past, and they largely come in seed, not even early stage, right? Deep tech disruptions start at a seed level. While mortality will be high, I think some of them will be huge disruptors.
Sure. I think to move on to, and I think that answered the question by the attendee. To move on to the next question, I think they want to know the minimum ticket size for investment, which Chirate or Bloom generally looks at.
We're a super early stage fund. We do seed to pre-series A. So the smallest checks we do now in the new fund, we have a $100 million fund now. So people have to understand it's not about the firms, it's about generally fund sizes. If they're aware of our fund sizes, they'll know that and the stage we play, they know that approximately that's where our sweet spots are. So we start with $500,000 and go up to $1.5 million, but usually have reserves of 2 to 3 to 4 million additionally on top of that to play, to maintain our stakes and our winners. So as the companies are breaking out, we play more capital. TCM, of course, Chirite, he can answer.
Yeah, we do seed and yearly. So in that context, it is between $500,000 to $5 million.
Sure. I think I'll take up another question which Sandeep has on about if loss-making companies will be allowed to take the IPO route by the government. So I think SEBI had in 2018, and I think I was also part of that committee, which was basically drafting the policies and the regulations around having an exclusive listing platform exclusively for the startups. So loss making or profit making essentially wasn't the criteria there. There was a different set of criteria which was laid down after several rounds of market consultations and road shows that we conducted. So I think that is a route which is available to them. Hasn't been explored yet, and there have been no takers. Interestingly, after the regulations were out, but that's another route that you may explore if you want to go IPO going forward. So that criteria would essentially apply.
So 2 points on this, Harshita. One is that I think not just loss making, even business plans have been taken public in the country. Okay, 2008 January, Reliance Power went public on business plan. Okay, so long as it's a QIP company, it's okay. I think the second one is that separate exchange for loss-making companies or startup companies. I think that institutional trading platform in various forms that has come in has not been successful because I don't think we see liquidity there, and so I think there has to be liquidity.
That's right, TCM, but also I think that goes in circles because when we were deliberating around it, along with SEBI and as part of the committee, what we realized is that unless it's tested, and you're right, nobody has tested it. There were a few takers in the ITP, which was the earlier platform, but absolutely no takers after the revised platform came in, which is the Innovators Growth Platform. And the challenge is that unless we see companies going into that cycle of IPO through these separate platforms, we will not know whether there is really liquidity or not. Because when we were consulting the market, interestingly, and we spoke to VCs as well, the angels, the VCs, and the startups, we saw that there is traction. People may be interested, but it's all about the trying and getting into it, which I don't think has happened. So yeah, you're right. So it hasn't been successful, but it would remain as a test of time. Let's see some startups moving in there and then maybe trying for liquidity. I think I don't think there's any other question that we've really left at except for one, which is on crowdfunding. So will it take over and surge ahead, having having more small ticket investors and huge funding opportunities? So any one of you want to dig at that question?
Yeah, no, we've seen, I feel the answer is the variant of what TCM said about non-liquid ITP like platforms. So these are things which work for the angel stage, right? And they're a proxy for a more efficient distributed angel group. So I think they were the predecessors to what we're all trying to do in COVID environments, which is we don't need to see each other and meet in a physical office. We can actually get work done if there is a relationship and there is trust. And what crowdfunding I think will do if they can do successfully. And if you see AngelList's syndicate model, which even Let's Venture is trying to angel groups and crowdfunding platforms, they're built on a network of trust. Somebody who they trust has brought them into the network, right? And then you essentially think that you're collectively bargaining for something and for a certain set of rights, and you're simply taking a mutualized risk in some cool startup. The problem I have with it is even in a perfectly aligned, 100 angels coming to a room, physical room, and trying to do a deal, it's usually 2 people who do the other work, the other 20 come for the party, right? And so, yes, it's capital, but like as an entrepreneur, am I like super kicked about getting relatively dumb capital? I don't know. I actually prefer the Indiegogo model, which is like crowdfunding for a product idea. So, hey, I'm building this cool product. It's like this gizmo. I'll ship you one of these for $500, right? You give me $500, right? Similarly, there's some lot of it going on in NGO causes, healthcare, people who can't afford it, and people. So there are various versions of this, but I always feel they appeal to not a classic investor mindset objective, but more an emotional objective, right? So personally, for someone who graduated out of angel investing into institutional avatar, I'm not a fan. I will never go back to it, right? So for me to advocate to someone that that is the way to do investing, no, I would never say it, right? It's not for me. It's not for anyone who will come to me for advice.
cCep, do you have different views? I think I would like to agree with Karthik here on this.
I don't
More
have
to the
different,
objective of raising.
I don't have different views. I think significantly uh, in times going forward, it's going to be challenging for even an entrepreneur to marry a crowd-funded team, a crowd-funded investor group, and then also have institutional investors coming in, like us in the later round. That's going to be a bigger challenge because we have all faced challenges, even in the angel group formats. So there will be a little bit of wariness.
One thing that I would add, Ashita, I think, crowdfunding per se, is not worked out anywhere else in the market, in the global market as well. What's critical is that, is really that how do you actually keep, two things. One is the crowdfunding is how do you really make the retail investors participate in the startup growth story, unless they are listed somewhere. And then the second question is that how do you really keep the seed stage funding going? So you see this cycle globally that as funds starts going to the second generation and third generation, and so forth, you state that the fund size is going up and up. Like Karthik pointed out, it's a function of fund sizes, what ticket size that you actually do. So I think crowdfunding is not something that's going to probably take off, but what's critical is that there is new funds being formed that's going to keep on addressing the seed stage requirements to create really a larger funnel. Because the established fund managers are going to invariably increase their fund sizes, and particularly they're going to be if they're going to be successful in the investments. So I think it's a very, very critical part of, you see Sequoia coming up with the Surge initiative, and I think there was also Chirati was also having some initiatives in the space. But I think that point of concerted efforts from the venture ecosystem to keep the seed funding available from an institutional point is critical, actually.
Thank you, Praveen. So I think on that note, and although it will be hard to predict the lasting impact of the pandemic, the future that we envision post-COVID is definitely one where people and businesses are prepared and enabled through technology. Whether it is to continue business operations or maintain access to essential services and needs, the digital economy is going to play a crucial role in all aspects of our lives. And this would be a brave world we will have to create together. And now is the time to for enterprises and entrepreneurs to empower and work and build it together. So with this note, I think I would close the panel, and thank you very much for all of you for joining us today, and special thanks to Karthik, TCM, and Praveen for joining us as panelists.